Lieutenant James Barrett was 23 years old. He had never seen a man die. He had never shot down an enemy plane, and he had never felt the impact of a 20mm cannon shell tearing through aluminium at 300 miles per hour. At 0847 hours on the 26th of June, 1943, he was flying his P-47 Thunderbolt at 26,000 feet over Abbeville, France. The outside temperature was -22 degrees Fahrenheit. His fuel gauges read 197 gallons. At current consumption, that gave him 92 minutes of flying time. He was part of the 56th Fighter Group, the Wolfpack, on an escort mission supporting 96 B-17 Flying Fortresses attacking the Villers-Coublay airfield outside Paris. Barrett was a kid from Tulsa, Oklahoma. He had grown up hunting rabbits in the red dirt country, dreaming of flight. Now he was strapped into 7 tons of aluminium and steel, cruising at 285 miles per hour, breathing oxygen through a rubber mask that chafed his skin raw. The vibration of the 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine was a constant numbing hum in his bones. He checked his fuel gauges again. He checked his ammunition counters. 3,400 rounds across 8 50 caliber machine guns. He checked his 6 o'clock position through the rearview mirror mounted above the canopy. The sky was empty. It was a perfect blue void, so clear and cold it hurt to look at. The condensation trails of the bomber formation ahead stretched across the sky like chalk lines on a blackboard. Somewhere below, the coast of France was a grey smudge against the darker grey of the English Channel. Barrett had flown 19 combat missions. In those 19 missions, he had not shot down a single enemy aircraft. He had fired his guns twice. Once at a Focke-Wulf 190 that was already spinning toward the ground, the pilot dead or unconscious at the controls. Once at a distant speck that he thought was a Messerschmitt 109 but could not confirm. He had missed both times, or perhaps they were already lost, he did not know. The other pilots in his squadron had kills. Lieutenant Morrison had 3. Captain Vickers had 7. Even the replacement pilots, fresh from training with fewer than 10 hours in the P-47, were scoring victories. Barrett was beginning to think there was something wrong with him, a failure of nerve, a lack of killer instinct. His crew chief, Staff Sergeant Frank Dawson, told him not to worry about it. Dawson was 38 years old, which made him ancient by Army Air Force standards. He had grease permanently etched into the creases of his hands and pockets full of wrenches and safety wire. He spoke with the slow, deliberate cadence of a man from Springfield, Illinois, who had spent 20 years fixing machinery that other men broke. Dawson treated the aircraft the way some men treated children, with patience, with care, with a quiet, unstated love that showed itself in small gestures. A polished windscreen, a perfectly adjusted seat harness, an extra 5 minutes spent checking the magnetos, even though they had checked fine the first time. The P-47 they flew together was serial number 428235. On the nose, beneath the cockpit, someone had painted the name Half Pint in white letters. It was Barrett's nickname for his wife, Sarah. She was 4 feet 11 inches tall and weighed 98 pounds. When he had left for England, she had stood on the train platform in Tulsa, waving a handkerchief, and he had thought his heart would crack open right there. He wrote to her every day, short letters, simple sentences. He never mentioned the fear. He never mentioned the bombers he had seen explode into orange fireballs, or the parachutes with bodies that hung too still, or the way some pilots got drunk in the officers' club and stared at the walls until dawn. Dawson had lost a son at Pearl Harbor. His name was David. He was 19 years old, a gunner on the USS Arizona. When the forward magazine exploded at 0806 on December 7, 1941, there was nothing left to bury. Dawson never talked about it. He kept a photograph in his wallet, but he never took it out. Barrett had only seen it once, by accident, when Dawson was paying for drinks at the pub in Halesworth. After that, Dawson had started treating Barrett differently. Not like a pilot, like a son. He fussed over the pre-flight checks. He made sure Barrett's parachute was packed correctly. He stood on the hardstand every morning before dawn, waiting, watching the sky, until Half-Pint returned and the engine shut down and Barrett climbed out onto the wing. The radio crackled. "Wolfpack leader to all aircraft. Bogies, 12 o'clock high. Estimate 40 plus. Climbing." Barrett's stomach tightened. 40-plus enemy fighters. That was the entire strength of a Luftwaffe fighter group. JG-26, probably. The Schlagetter wing. They were based at Abbeville, less than 30 miles from here. The intelligence briefing that morning had said the Luftwaffe would be up, but in moderate strength. 10 to 15 fighters, they had said, a standard harassment force. The intelligence briefing had been catastrophically wrong. Barrett scanned the sky above. At first he saw nothing. Then, at 32,000 feet, a cluster of black dots detached themselves from the sun. They were diving. Fast. Focke-Wulf 190s, the most dangerous fighter in the Luftwaffe inventory. BMW 801. Radial engines, brutal acceleration, 4 20mm cannons and 2 13mm machine guns. Pilots who knew how to use them. Wolfpack, drop tanks, engage at will. Barrett reached down and hit the release for his belly-mounted drop tank. 300 gallons of high-octane fuel tumbled away, falling 5 miles toward the earth below. Without the drag of the tank, the P-47 felt lighter, more responsive. He switched his fuel selector to the main tank and checked his quantity. 142 gallons, 68 minutes. He turned on his gun sight. The illuminated reticle appeared in the center of the windscreen, a circle with a dot in the middle. Simple, effective. If the target filled the circle at 200 yards, you pulled the trigger and the convergence of 8 gun barrels would tear it apart. The Focke-Wulfs were closer now. Barrett could see the details, the wide radial cowlings, the yellow nose markings of JG-26, the black and white checkerboard pattern on the engine cowls that marked the first grouper. One of them rolled inverted and dove straight at Barrett's flight. Barrett broke left. The other 3 P-47s in his flight scattered like startled birds. The Focke-Wulf flashed past, so close that Barrett could see the pilot's face behind the armored glass, a flash of leather helmet, goggles, then gone. Barrett pulled the stick back and climbed, trying to gain altitude, trying to get above the fight. The P-47 was not a dogfighter. It was too heavy, too slow to accelerate in a turn, but it could dive faster than anything the Germans had, and it could climb on the power of that massive Pratt & Whitney engine and the General Electric turbocharger buried in the tail. He leveled off at 27,000 feet and looked around. The sky was chaos. P-47s and Focke-Wulfs tangled together in a twisting, turning furball that stretched for 10 miles. Tracer rounds arced across the blue. White smoke trails marked the paths of aircraft pulling high G turns. A parachute blossomed. Barrett could not tell if it was American or German. He looked for a target, something isolated, something he could attack without getting bounced by another fighter. The training films had made it sound simple. Get on the enemy's 6, close to 200 yards, short burst, disengage. But nothing in combat was simple. Every time he tried to maneuver, another Focke-Wulf appeared. The Germans were hunting in pairs. Classic tactics. One fighter would bait the Americans into a turn. The second would come in from the side and shoot. Barrett saw a Focke-Wulf below him, chasing a damaged B-17 that had dropped out of formation. The bomber's No. 3 engine was on fire. The propeller was windmilling, trailing black smoke. The Focke-Wulf was closing, lining up for the kill. Barrett rolled inverted and pulled the nose down. The altimeter unwound rapidly. 27,000, 25,000, 23,000. The airspeed indicator climbed. 300 miles per hour, 320, 350. The P-47 was heavy and fast in the dive, like a brick with wings. He was closing on the Focke-Wulf. The German pilot was fixated on the bomber. He had not seen Barrett. 500 yards, 400, 300. Barrett put the illuminated dot on the fighter's tail and began to squeeze the trigger. Then the world exploded. Barrett did not hear the shots. At that altitude, at that speed, sound traveled slower than metal. The first thing he registered was a violent shudder that slammed his head forward into the gun sight, then back against the armored headrest. The instrument panel in front of him disintegrated. Glass shards sprayed across his oxygen mask. A hole the size of a fist appeared in the center of the panel, daylight pouring through. Hydraulic fluid erupted from the severed lines beneath the floor. Hot, smelling of burnt chemicals. MILH 5606 specification. Red in color, 1,200 pounds per square inch of pressure now spraying across his boots and flight suit. The stick went dead in his hand. The rudder pedals flopped uselessly beneath his feet. The P-47 rolled violently to the right, tumbling out of formation, out of control, falling. A Focke-Wulf 190, flown by Hauptmann Werner Hoffmann, had dived out of the sun and unloaded a 1.3-second burst from four 20mm MG-151 cannons and two 13mm MG-131 machine guns into the P-47's fuselage and cockpit. Werner Hoffmann was 28 years old. He had 87 confirmed aerial victories. He wore the Ritterkreuz, the Knight's Cross, around his neck. He was one of the deadliest fighter pilots in the Luftwaffe, and he knew exactly where to aim. Not at the wings, not at the engine, at the cockpit, at the pilot, at the hydraulic lines, at the control cables. The first shell had severed the main hydraulic pressure line. The second had sheared through the control cables that ran beneath the cockpit floor. The third had punched through the instrument panel and exited through the right side of the fuselage. The fourth had struck the radio equipment behind the pilot's seat and vaporized it into fragments of shattered vacuum tubes and molten copper wire. Barrett fought the controls. The stick moved freely, disconnected from the control surfaces. The rudder pedals were dead. The aircraft was rolling, spinning, falling. The horizon tumbled past the windscreen. Sky, ground, too fast to track. The altimeter unwound like a broken watch. 23,000 feet, 20,000, 18,000. He was falling at 5,200 feet per minute, 3,100 feet every 36 seconds. The mathematics of death were precise and unforgiving. Smoke began to fill the cockpit, thin, grey, the smell of burning insulation and hydraulic fluid. Fire was the greatest fear of every pilot. If the fuel tank behind the seat ruptured, he would be incinerated in 3 seconds. A flash of flame, a puff of black smoke, a twisted, charred skeleton falling 5 miles into the channel. Barrett reached for the canopy release handle. It was a red, T-shaped lever on the left side of the cockpit. He pulled. Nothing happened. He pulled harder, using both hands. The canopy frame had been twisted by the impact of the cannon shells. The locking mechanism was jammed. The heavy plexiglass canopy that protected him from the slipstream at 300 miles per hour had become a sealed coffin. He hammered on the glass with his gloved fists. He kicked at the frame with his boots. The canopy did not move. He was trapped, locked inside a machine that was spinning toward the ocean at terminal velocity. He stopped fighting. There was no point. He had perhaps 90 seconds before impact, maybe less. The mathematics were simple and final. 5,000 feet of altitude, 5,200 feet per minute of descent, 58 seconds. He thought about Sarah, standing on the train platform, waving her handkerchief, 4 feet 11 inches tall, 98 pounds. He had promised her he would come home. He had promised. He thought about Dawson, standing on the hardstand before dawn, waiting, watching the sky, the way he polished the windscreen, the way he adjusted the harness straps, the photograph of his son that he never showed anyone. Then, at 8,100 feet, the P-47 did something that no other fighter aircraft in the world could do. It stabilized itself. The massive weight of the 2,000 horsepower radial engine in the nose, combined with the aerodynamic stability designed into the airframe by Republic Aviation's engineers, pulled the aircraft out of its spin. The center of gravity at 25.5% mean aerodynamic chord and the vertical stabilizer area of 31.6 square feet created a self-recovery characteristic unique to the Thunderbolt. The tumbling stopped. The horizon steadied. Barrett found himself flying straight and level, heading west toward England at 8,000 feet. He sat in the cockpit, breathing hard, his heart hammering against his ribs. The instrument panel was destroyed, half the gauges were gone, but the engine was still running. The propeller was still turning, the aircraft was flying. He tried the controls again. The stick moved, but nothing happened. The cables were severed. He tried the rudder pedals. Dead. He reached for the trim tabs, the small electric motors that adjusted the angle of the tail surfaces. The switch clicked. The aircraft responded. Slowly, sluggishly, but it responded. He could steer the aircraft using the trim tabs alone. It was like trying to control a car by adjusting the alignment instead of turning the steering wheel. Imprecise, dangerous, but possible. He looked around. The sky was empty. The dogfight had moved on, chasing the bomber stream deeper into France. He was alone, crippled, bleeding from the cut on his forehead where his head had struck the gun sight, flying a wreck over the hostile waters of the English Channel. Then he saw the Focke-Wulf. Werner Hoffmann had followed him down. The German fighter pulled alongside, 50 yards off Barrett's right wing. Hoffmann could see the damage, the shattered canopy, the holes in the fuselage, the oil streaming back from the cowling in dark streaks. He looked at Barrett. Barrett looked back. There was no expression on the German pilot's face, just professional assessment. The evaluation of a craftsman inspecting his work. Hoffmann knew the American was defenseless. He circled around to get behind the P-47, positioning himself for the kill shot. Barrett braced himself. He could not turn. He could not dive. He could not evade. He could only sit and wait for the bullets to come. Hoffmann opened fire. The sound was like hail on a tin roof. 7.92mm machine gun bullets hammered into the P-47's fuselage at 900 rounds per minute. They tore through the thin aluminium skin. They shredded the elevator control surfaces. They punched through the cockpit floor 6 inches from Barrett's feet. But they did not penetrate the armor plate behind the pilot's seat. The P-47 Thunderbolt was built like a tank. It had more armor protection than any fighter aircraft in the war. A 1/4-inch steel plate behind the pilot's head, an armored glass windscreen, protective plating around the oil cooler and fuel tanks. Barrett hunched his shoulders, making himself as small as possible, listening to the metal disintegrating around him. The sound was intimate, personal. He could hear each individual impact. Punch, punch, punch. 207 hits in a single pass. Hoffmann pulled up, surprised. The American aircraft was still flying. He came around for a second pass. This time, he used his 20mm cannons, 4 MG-151 autocannons mounted in the wing roots, each one firing 120 rounds per minute. High explosive incendiary shells. The shells slammed into the fuselage. Chunks of metal the size of dinner plates flew off the aircraft. The rudder was blown completely away, tumbling end over end toward the water below. The radio equipment behind Barrett's head, already damaged, was vaporized. The tail section was perforated with holes. 21 cannon strikes in total. The P-47 shuddered. The airframe groaned. But the Pratt & Whitney R2800 kept running. It was missing cylinders. It was leaking oil from a dozen punctures. But it kept turning the 4-bladed propeller. 2,000 horsepower of American engineering, built by craftsmen in East Hartford, Connecticut, refusing to die. Hoffmann had exhausted his ammunition. 120 rounds of 20mm, 900 rounds of 7.92. All of it poured into a single target. He flew alongside the ruined American fighter one last time. He shook his head slowly, side to side, a gesture of disbelief. Then he rocked his wings. A salute. The gesture of one warrior to another, recognition of courage, acknowledgement of the machine's impossible toughness. And he peeled off toward France, climbing, heading home to Abbeville. He assumed the P-47 would crash within minutes. No aircraft could sustain that amount of battle damage and remain airborne. The American pilot would ditch in the channel, if he was lucky, or the aircraft would break apart if he was not. But it was not over. Barrett was alive, bleeding, alone, but alive. He steered the crippled aircraft west, toward England, using the electric trim tabs. The controls were mushy, unresponsive. Every input had to be made carefully, gently, like coaxing a dying animal to take one more step. The engine was running rough. The oil pressure was dropping. 50 pounds per square inch. 45. 40. The oil temperature was climbing. 185 degrees Fahrenheit. 200. 210. He reduced the throttle, keeping the revolutions per minute low to prevent the engine from seizing. 1800 RPM, the minimum needed to maintain altitude. The English coast appeared ahead, a grey line against the darker grey of the water. He crossed it at an altitude of 600 feet. Too low to bail out, even if he could get the canopy open. He had to land. The emergency airfield at Manston was 73 statute miles from his current position. At 165 miles per hour, trimming the aircraft constantly to maintain heading, fighting the controls every second, it would take 26.5 minutes. He had 23 minutes of fuel remaining. Impossible. But there was a tailwind, 18 miles per hour out of the east, pushing him home. Ground speed 183 miles per hour. 73 miles at 183 miles per hour was 24 minutes. Possible. Barely. He flew on. The fuel gauge dropped. 45 gallons. 38. 29. The coastline passed beneath him. Green fields, small villages, the shadows of clouds moving across the earth like the hands of a clock. Manston Airfield appeared ahead, the emergency haven for crippled bombers returning from Germany. It had a runway 10,000 feet long and 200 feet wide, designed for aircraft with no brakes, no hydraulics, no control. It was the last hope for crews who had nothing left but gravity and prayer. Barrett lined up on the concrete strip. He had no flaps to slow down, no brakes to stop, no way to reduce his speed except to cut the engine and hope. He was coming in at 178 miles per hour, 50 miles per hour faster than the normal landing speed. The wheels touched at 0914 hours. The tires held. The aircraft screamed down the runway, bleeding speed. 150 miles per hour, 120, 90, 60. It coasted for 11,088 feet, more than 2 miles, before finally rolling to a stop in the grass at the far end of the field. Barrett sat in the cockpit for a long time. He could not stop shaking. The adrenaline was draining out of his system, leaving him weak and nauseous. His hands trembled on the stick. His legs would not support his weight. Fire trucks and ambulances raced across the grass toward him. Ground crew scrambled up onto the wing. They had to pry the canopy open with crowbars, levering the twisted frame until the locking mechanism finally gave way with a shriek of tortured metal. When Barrett stepped out onto the wing, he finally saw what Werner Hoffmann had done to his aircraft. The P-47 was unrecognizable. It was not damaged, it was destroyed. 21 holes from 20mm cannon shells, 207 holes from machine gun bullets. The rudder was completely gone. The elevators were hanging by shreds of metal, flapping in the wind. The fuselage behind the cockpit looked like it had been attacked with a chainsaw. One of the propeller blades had a bullet hole through the steel. The skin of the aircraft was perforated. You could see daylight through the tail section. The structural ribs were severed. The hydraulic system was empty, every line cut. Oil dripped from a dozen punctures, forming dark pools on the concrete. The engineering officer at Manston, Lieutenant Patterson, walked around the aircraft twice. He took a piece of white chalk from his pocket and marked a large X on the side of the fuselage. Category E. Total loss. Scrap metal. Barrett was driven back to Halesworth in a jeep. He went to the debriefing room. He drank a shot of whiskey that burned his throat and did nothing to stop his hands from shaking. He wrote a letter to Sarah. He did not mention the mission. He told her about the food in the mess hall. He told her he missed her. He signed it, "All my love, Jim," and sealed the envelope. The next morning, June 27th, a flatbed truck arrived at Halesworth, carrying the carcass of Barrett's P-47. It was dumped in the boneyard, a muddy field behind the maintenance hangars, where dead airplanes went to rot. This should have been the end of the story. The aircraft had done its job. It had brought its pilot home. It was finished. But Staff Sergeant Frank Dawson did not see a finished airplane. To understand why a rational man would attempt to resurrect a destroyed fighter aircraft, you have to understand the desperation of the summer of 1943. The air war over Europe was reaching a breaking point. The United States 8th Air Force was bleeding to death. The strategy of daylight precision bombing was failing. The theory had been simple. Heavily armed B-17 flying fortresses, flying in tight defensive formations, could fight their way to targets deep inside Germany without fighter escorts. The massed firepower of 50 caliber machine guns would shred any attacking fighters. The theory was wrong. The Luftwaffe had developed tactics to strip the formations apart. They attacked from head-on, from 12 o'clock high, targeting the cockpits and flight decks where the bombers had no defensive guns. They used cannon fire to blow off wings and tail sections. They coordinated attacks from multiple angles simultaneously, overwhelming the defensive fire. The loss rates were catastrophic. In 1 week in October, the 8th Air Force would lose 148 bombers. That was 1,480 men killed or captured in 7 days. The survival rate for a bomber crewman completing a 25-mission tour was roughly 25%. 3 out of 4 would not make it home. The only thing that could stop the slaughter was long-range fighter escorts. But in June of 1943, there were no long-range fighters. The Supermarine Spitfires of the Royal Air Force could barely reach the coast of France before their fuel ran low. The P-47 Thunderbolt, massive and fuel-thirsty, could push to the Belgian border, perhaps to the Ruhr Valley on a good day. But beyond that, the bombers were on their own. Every fighter aircraft was precious. A new P-47D cost $97,000 in 1943. But the money did not matter. Time mattered. It took months to build an aircraft at the Republic Aviation Factory in Farmingdale, New York. Then it had to be test-flown, disassembled, crated, loaded onto a cargo ship, shipped across the Atlantic Ocean, where German U-boats were sinking supply vessels, reassembled in England, test-flown again, and delivered to a combat unit. 6 weeks if everything went perfectly. 12 weeks if it did not. At Halesworth, the 56th Fighter Group was authorized 48 aircraft. They had 31 flyable. The ground crews were working 20-hour shifts. They slept on cots in the hangars. They ate cold rations with greasy hands. They worked in unheated maintenance shelters where the wind whistled through the cracks and the temperature dropped below freezing at night. These men were the invisible foundation of the air war. They were not officers. They did not get medals. Their names did not appear in newspapers. Most were high school dropouts. Farm boys from Iowa and Kansas. Mechanics from auto garages in Detroit and Pittsburgh. Kids who had grown up taking apart Model T Fords and farm tractors. But they possessed an intuitive genius for mechanical systems. They could diagnose a misfiring cylinder by the sound alone. They could weld aluminium in the dark. They could improvise solutions that the engineers at Republic Aviation said were impossible. Staff Sergeant Frank Dawson was one of these men. Dawson was standing at the window of the maintenance shop when the flatbed truck arrived on the morning of June 27th. He watched them unload the wreckage, watched them drive away. Then he walked out to the boneyard. He walked around Half Pint slowly, running his hand over the jagged holes in the aluminium skin. He looked at the severed control cables. He looked at the crushed tail section. He looked at the chalk X on the fuselage. Most men saw a pile of junk. Dawson saw something else. He saw the aircraft that had brought Jim Barrett home. He saw the machine he had maintained for 8 months, checking every rivet, testing every system, trusting his work to keep a 23-year-old kid from Tulsa alive. The Luftwaffe had tried to take that aircraft away from him. They had smashed it, burned it, riddled it with holes. Dawson took that personally. He walked back to the maintenance office and found Captain Richard Hayes, the engineering officer. Hayes was 33 years old, a graduate of MIT, a man who understood stress calculations and metal fatigue and structural failure modes. "Captain," Dawson said, "I want to fix that plane." Hayes looked up from his paperwork. He stared at Dawson for a long moment. Then he laughed. Not cruelly, just the reflexive response of a rational man confronted with an absurd statement. "That's a Category E write-off, Sergeant. The tail is practically severed. The main spar might be twisted. It would take hundreds of man-hours. Parts we don't have. Tools we don't have. It's impossible. And it's against regulations. Dawson did not back down. He was a small man, 5 feet 7 inches, 140 pounds. But there was something in his eyes that made Hayes stop laughing. "Sir," Dawson said, "waiting for a replacement could take 6 weeks. I have 3 mechanics who will work nights. I can scavenge parts from other wrecks. Give me 1 week, and I will give you a combat-ready fighter." Hayes leaned back in his chair. He knew the situation. The 56th Fighter Group was short on aircraft. The bomber crews were being slaughtered. Every day they were short a fighter meant 12 to 18 bomber crewmen died. He also knew that regulations were written by men who had never stood in a freezing hangar at 3 in the morning, trying to keep pilots alive with nothing but hand tools and determination. 1 week, Hayes said. "And if it falls apart on the runway, Sergeant, it's your stripes." Dawson nodded once. He turned and walked out. He had made a promise that sounded insane to anyone who knew anything about aeronautical engineering, but he had also made a promise to himself. He would bring Half-Pint back from the dead. Dawson gathered his team in the boneyard that afternoon. 3 men stood with him in the rain, looking at the wreckage. It was a cold, steady drizzle that soaked through their wool uniforms. The aircraft smelled of burnt oil and hydraulic fluid. Sergeant Thaddeus McKinley was 29 years old, a welder from Pittsburgh who had worked in the steel mills before the war. He had shoulders like a prize fighter and hands that could hold a welding torch steady for 6 hours. He looked at the severed tail section and shook his head. "Frank, that's scrap." Corporal Vincent Kowalski was 24, a hydraulics specialist from Detroit. He had rebuilt brake systems on Ford Model A's when he was 16. He crouched down and looked at the severed hydraulic lines. "Every line is cut. We'd have to replumb the whole system." Private First Class Leland Harper was 19 years old, from a farm outside Nashville, Tennessee. He handled the electrical systems. He looked at the shredded wiring and whistled softly. 247 wires, Sarge." Dawson lit a cigarette. He took a long drag and pointed at the tail section. "We're going to cut it off, right here at Station 240 Bulkhead." McKinley frowned. "And then?" "Then we find another bird, cut the tail off her, and sew it onto this one." The 3 men stared at him. "You're talking about grafting," Kowalski said. "Splicing 2 airframes." "Frank, if that weld fails at 7 Gs, the pilot's dead." Dawson dropped his cigarette and ground it out. "I know the risks. I also know I can do it. Get the torches." To understand what Dawson was proposing, you need to understand the P-47 Thunderbolt. Fully loaded, it weighed 13,500 pounds, twice the weight of a Spitfire. The heart was the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, 18 cylinders in 2 radial rows, 2,000 horsepower, 2,800 cubic inches of displacement. But what made the P-47 unique was its turbocharger system. The turbocharger was located in the rear fuselage, 20 feet behind the propeller. A massive duct, 14 inches in diameter, ran from the air intake under the nose, underneath the cockpit, through the belly, all the way back to the turbocharger. The compressed air was then piped forward to the engine. The exhaust gases were piped backward to spin the turbine. The fuselage was effectively a hollow tube packed with ducting, control cables, hydraulic lines, and electrical wiring. The aircraft used semi-monocoque construction. There was no internal chassis. The aluminium skin itself, reinforced by internal ribs and stringers, carried the structural load. If you cut the skin, the aircraft lost strength. If you severed the fuselage, the airframe would snap in half under high-speed flight stress. Dawson was proposing to splice 2 broken halves together, reconnect the turbocharger ducting, align control cables to within a fraction of an inch, splice 247 electrical wires, weld the structural skin to withstand 7 times the force of gravity, without factory jigs, without engineering drawings, without precision tools, in a muddy field, in England, in freezing rain. Captain Hayes knew Republic Aviation's tolerances were measured in thousandths of an inch. He looked at Dawson's oil-stained, scarred hands, and saw disaster. But he also understood the bond between crew chief and pilot. Dawson had watched Barrett climb into that cockpit 19 times. He had seen the exhaustion in Barrett's eyes. He had cleaned vomit from the cockpit when the stress became too much. He had patched bullet holes and checked every system twice because one missed rivet could mean death. When Barrett brought Half Pint back destroyed, Dawson did not see mechanical failure. He saw personal affront. He felt moral obligation to give his pilot a machine that would bring him home again. Dawson was not just fixing an aircraft, he was armoring his friend against death. The resurrection began with a search through the boneyard. They needed a donor aircraft with a destroyed nose but intact tail. They found it 3 rows over, P-47D2, serial number 427893. It had ground-looped on landing 2 weeks earlier. The landing gear had collapsed, the nose had crumpled, the propeller blades had bent backward, but the rear fuselage was pristine. The mechanics worked in the rain, stripping the donor aircraft. They removed the elevators, the rudder, the tailwheel assembly. They unbolted the horizontal stabilizers. Then they had to cut the fuselage. They had hacksaws with tungsten carbide blades and oxyacetylene torches that burned at 6,300 degrees Fahrenheit. Dawson measured the cut line on both aircraft. Station 240, 32 inches aft of the cockpit, the main structural ring. The cutting was brutal labor. The aluminium skin was 0.64 inches thick. McKinley and Kowalski took turns with the hacksaw, sweating despite the cold. The saw teeth bit into metal with a screaming rasp. When they switched to the torch, the intense white flame melted through aluminium like butter. Molten metal dripped and hissed in puddles. The smell of hot metal and vaporized paint filled the air. When the halves were separated, the true magnitude became visible. The 14-inch turbocharger duct gaped open. Bundles of electrical wiring hung loose. Steel control cables were snapped and coiled. Hydraulic lines dangled, weeping small drops of red fluid. They used a 2-ton hoist to lift the new tail section. The cable creaked. They maneuvered it across the boneyard, dragging it through mud to the maintenance hangar, where Half Pint's forward section sat on wooden jacks. The hangar was a drafty, corrugated steel structure with a concrete floor stained black from oil. Bare bulbs hung on frayed cords. It was late November weather in June. The damp cold seeped into everything. The metal was so cold it burned bare skin. The mechanics wore wool gloves with fingers cut off. Their breath steamed as they maneuvered the donor tail into position. This was the critical moment. The alignment had to be perfect. If the tail was crooked by even half a degree, the aircraft would fly sideways. At 400 miles per hour, that would create vibration. Severe vibration could tear the plane apart, ripping rivets and snapping structural members. Republic Aviation used massive 2-story steel jigs, precision fixtures holding components with tolerances of 15,000ths of an inch. Dawson had 4 hydraulic jacks, some wooden blocks, and a plumb bob, a weight on a string. He hung the plumb bob from the vertical stabilizer tip. He measured distance to the engine cowling. He adjusted the jacks. He measured again. He crawled on the concrete and sighted along the keel. Up 1/16 on the left. McKinley turned the jack handle 1 click. Down a hair on the right. Another adjustment. They did this for 11 hours, measuring, adjusting, measuring again. They used mason's twine stretched from propeller hub to tail cone to check the center line. It was primitive engineering, ancient technique. The same methods used to build pyramids applied to a fighter designed to fly at 430 miles per hour. At 0300 hours on June 30th, Dawson was satisfied. He clamped the sections together. Final measurement, 0.008 of an inch error, 0.008. Better than factory specification of 15 thousandths. Now came the grafting. They could not weld the skin. Heat would weaken the aluminum alloy. They had to rivet. They had to create a splicing plate, a band of aluminum bridging the gap, overlapping both sections. Harper cut the plate from 0.64-inch 2024 T3 aluminum alloy. He traced the fuselage circumference and cut a band 16 inches wide. Then they drilled holes. 1,847 holes. Each had to be precisely aligned. The pneumatic rivet gun echoed like machine gun fire. Rat-tat-tat-tat, day and night. One man inside the cramped fuselage held a steel bucking bar against each rivet's back. The other stood outside with the rivet gun, driving it home with repeated hammer blows at 118 decibels. McKinley worked inside. The internal space was barely wider than his shoulders. He crawled through the turbocharger ducting, a metal tube 19 inches in diameter and 12 feet long, holding the bucking bar by feel. The rivet gun was deafening inside the tube. The vibration numbed his hands. After 2 hours, he could not feel his fingers. After 4, his ears rang so badly he could not hear conversation. But he kept working. Harper reconnected the turbocharger ducting. The sections had to mate perfectly. Any gap would cause a leak, loss of manifold pressure, loss of power at altitude, or exhaust gases leaking into the cockpit, carbon monoxide slowly poisoning the pilot. He worked by a single 75-watt bulb. He sealed joints with high-temperature compound, then secured connections with steel hose clamps, torqued to 45 foot-pounds. He checked each connection twice. They reconnected control cables. 7 steel cables, 7/32 of an inch in diameter, running from stick and rudder pedals through pulleys and bell cranks to control surfaces. The cables had to be spliced using nickerpress sleeves, each sleeve crimped with exact pressure. Too little, the cable would slip. Too much, strands would crush and weaken. Kowalski reconnected hydraulic lines. 3/8-inch aluminium tubing carrying MIL-H5606 fluid at 1,200 psi. Each line cut to length, flared at ends, connected with AN fittings torqued to specification. 18 foot-pounds for -6 fittings, 25 for -8. After connection, he bled the system, purging air bubbles. Harper spliced electrical wiring. 247 wires, each stripped, twisted with its mate, soldered with 60/40 tin lead solder, wrapped with friction tape. Red to red, black to black, white stripe to white stripe. One mistake could cause electrical fire or disable critical systems. The work continued around the clock. They slept 4-hour shifts on canvas cots. They ate cold sandwiches. They drank coffee that tasted like battery acid. Their hands were raw, their backs ached, their eyes burned. The Frankenstein nature became obvious. The forward fuselage was olive drab. The donor tail was unpainted, natural aluminium. The Army had stopped painting aircraft in late '42 to save weight. 60 pounds and 12 man-hours per aircraft. The result looked like two machines had collided and fused. Olive nose, silver tail, a band of fresh rivets circling the fuselage like a surgical scar. It looked ridiculous. But as days passed, the machine became whole. While the structure healed, Dawson turned to the engine. The R2800 had been hit, but the damage was mostly external. Cylinders were intact, the crankcase had not been penetrated, but the oil cooler was shredded, and 3 cylinders showed scoring from debris ingestion. Dawson stripped the engine to bare block. He pulled each cylinder, inspecting piston rings and valve seats with a magnifying glass. He checked valve clearances with feeler gauges. He tested the magnetos. He replaced all 18 spark plugs with new Champion J11s, gapping each to 25 thousandths of an inch. He treated the engine with reverence. He knew that even if the airframe held, it meant nothing if the engine failed. There is a specific sound a healthy radial makes. Not a smooth hum, a rhythmic, syncopated growl, a cadence from 18 cylinders in 2 staggered rows. It sounds like controlled violence. Dawson knew that sound like a conductor knows each instrument. On the morning of July 4th, they were ready to test. They towed the 2-tone fighter to the run-up pad. They chocked the wheels. Dawson climbed into the cockpit. He primed the engine. 6 pumps, forcing raw fuel into cylinders. He engaged the inertia starter. The flywheel spun to 12,000 RPM, storing kinetic energy. The starter made a rising whine. At peak pitch, Dawson engaged the clutch. The 4-bladed propeller jerked. 1 blade, 2. The engine coughed. Blue smoke belched from exhausts. Then the Pratt & Whitney caught. The 18 cylinders began firing. The roar was immediate and visceral. The airframe shook. The tail lifted as the propeller bit air and tried to pull forward against chocks. Dawson watched gauges. Oil pressure climbed 0 to 65 psi in 8 seconds. Cylinder head temperature began rising. 180 degrees. Normal. He pushed throttle forward. The roar deepened to thunder. The aircraft strained like a leashed animal. He sat for 5 minutes, feeling vibration, listening for irregularities, feeling for telltale shudder, indicating structural weakness. There was nothing. The aircraft felt solid, whole, angry and eager. He pulled mixture to idle cutoff. The engine coughed twice and fell silent. The propeller windmilled to a stop. Captain Hayes walked up. He looked at mismatched paint, at fresh rivets circling like stitches on Frankenstein's monster. "It runs," Hayes said. "Yes, sir. But will it fly?" Dawson climbed out. He wiped his hands on an oil-dark rag. "It will fly, Captain. Question is, who's crazy enough to test it?" Regulations stated that a repaired aircraft had to be test-flown by a maintenance officer or designated test pilot. But this was not standard repair. This was unauthorized field reconstruction. If it crashed and killed the test pilot, Dawson would be court-martialed for manslaughter. There was only one person who should fly it. Lieutenant Jim Barrett had visited the hangar every day. He came before briefings. He came after debriefings. He stood in shadows and watched them work. He saw the care in every connection. He saw McKinley crawl into the turbocharger ducting for the 100th time, hands raw and bleeding. He saw Kowalski test each hydraulic fitting twice, then again. He saw Harper splice 247 wires by hand. He saw them sleeping on cots beside the fuselage. He saw them eating cold rations, standing, because sitting meant they might not rise. He saw Dawson, night after night, running hands over the splice line, feeling for imperfections only his fingers could detect. On the morning of July 6th, Barrett walked into the hangar. Half-Pint sat on concrete, jacks removed, resting on landing gear. The mismatched paint made her look like a circus animal, olive and silver, old and new, dead and reborn. Barrett walked up. He ran his hand along the splice line. He could feel the slight ridge where rivets joined sections. 1,847. He had watched everyone driven home. He looked at Dawson. "It's my aircraft, Sergeant. I'll take her up." Dawson shook his head. "Lieutenant, if she breaks apart, it's my court-martial. Let Hayes find a test pilot." "No one is expendable, Frank, and she won't break." "I watched you build her. I trust your work." "Sir, I trust you." The words hung in cold air. Dawson looked at Barrett, looked at the aircraft. He thought about his son David, 19 years old, dead at Pearl Harbor. He thought about the promise, "Keep this kid alive." "All right, Lieutenant, let's get you strapped in." The date was set for 10:15 hours, July 6, 1943. The entire base knew about the Frankenstein Thunderbolt. Pilots from other squadrons came to watch, ground crew from other hangars, even administrative staff who normally never left offices. They stood along the taxiway, smoking, talking in low voices. There was a betting pool, $240. Odds 8-1 the tail would separate on takeoff, 5-1 during first turn. The optimistic few bet on completing the test flight, but those paid 20-1. The skepticism was heavy. If Dawson's alignment was off even half a degree, the tail would act like a permanently deflected rudder. The pilot would fight controls constantly, unflyable. If structural integrity was compromised, if even a dozen of those rivets were weak, G-forces would rip the tail cleanly off. The aircraft would tumble. The pilot would have 2 seconds before impact. Barrett strapped in at 10:05. The smell was familiar. Fuel, oil, old sweat. But new smells too. Fresh paint, chemical sealing compound, ozone from new electrical connections. The instrument panel was pristine. Dawson had replaced all shattered gauges. Glass polished so clean it reflected morning light. The compass re-swung and calibrated. The artificial horizon tested and certified. Even the gun sight replaced, a new N9 with fresh bulb and clean optics. Behind the seat, Dawson had welded new armor plate, quarter-inch steel. No bullet impacts, no deformation. Virgin metal, ready to stop the next burst. Dawson climbed on the wing. He helped with shoulder straps, adjusted quick-release fittings, checked lap belt tension. He wiped oil from the windscreen. He looked at Barrett through the side window. "She's ready, Lieutenant." He did not say good luck. That was for superstitious men. Dawson believed in torque settings and safety wire and rivets driven to specification. Barrett closed the canopy. The heavy frame locked with a solid click. He was sealed inside again. Checklist from memory. Fuel selector main tank. Mixture full rich. Propeller full forward. Throttle cracked 1 inch. Parking brake set. He primed 6 times and engaged the inertia starter. The flywheel spun with rising whine. At peak RPM, he engaged clutch. The propeller turned. The engine coughed, caught, roared to life. The sound was different, stronger, more confident. The vibration felt tighter, more controlled. Dawson had rigged everything with slightly more tension than factory spec, giving instantaneous feedback. Barrett let the engine warm 3 minutes. Oil pressure stabilized at 65 psi. Cylinder head temperature climbed to 180. He checked magnetos. Left, right, both. RPM drop within limits. 50 on left, 45 on right. Perfect. He released parking brake and added power. Half-pint rolled forward. The tail came up as propeller blast pushed down on elevators. He steered with rudder pedals, taxiing toward runway 27. Wind from west at 12 knots. Perfect for takeoff. At runway end, he turned into wind and stopped. Pre-takeoff checklist. Fuel boost on. Mixture full rich. Propeller full forward. Flaps up. Trim tab set. Canopy locked. Harness tight. The tower gave clearance. Half-pint cleared for takeoff. Wind 270 at 12. Altimeter 3012. Good luck, Lieutenant. Barrett pushed throttle to 52 inches manifold pressure. Water injection kicked in automatically. The engine note changed from growl to bellow. 2,300 horsepower. War emergency power. The aircraft surged forward. Acceleration pushed Barrett into his seat. 60 miles per hour, 80, 100. The tail lifted. He could feel the tail section responding normally. No vibration, no shudder, tracking straight. 120. Barrett eased back on stick. Main wheels left ground. Half-pint climbed into morning air. Wheels retracted with solid thunks. Kowalski's hydraulic system worked perfectly. On the ground, 200 men held their breath. This was the moment. As weight transferred from gear to wings, structural stress on the fuselage changed. Bending loads increased. The splice now carried full tail section weight plus aerodynamic forces. If weak, the tail would droop, twist, separate. Barrett climbed to 5,000 feet. He circled once, getting feel. He flew straight and level, hands light. Stick forces felt normal, better than normal. He moved stick left and right, smooth, responsive, forward and back. Perfect. He keyed radio. Tower, half-pint. She flies straight. Hands off stick. She holds heading and altitude. On the ground, Dawson stood arms crossed, face expressionless. But his eyes were shining. Flying straight was one thing, combat was another. Barrett had to test limits. He climbed to 10,000 feet over empty farmland. He rolled inverted and pulled into a power dive. Altimeter unwound rapidly. 9,000, 8,000, 7,000. Airspeed climbed. 300, 350, 400, 420, 450. At 450 miles per hour, the wings flexed visibly. The fuselage groaned. Barrett could hear wind screaming over the canopy, a sustained shriek drowning the engine roar. He looked back at the tail. Still there. No movement, no flexing. The splice held. At 2,000 feet he pulled back hard. The nose came up. G-forces slammed him into seat. 4 Gs, 5, 6, 7. His body weight went from 165 pounds to 1,155 pounds. Blood drained from his head. Vision grayed at edges. He grunted, forcing blood back to brain. The aircraft shuddered under load. The airframe stressed to 93% of ultimate limit. The 1,847 rivets each carried hundreds of pounds of shear force. If one rivet failed, it would cascade. Stress would transfer to adjacent rivets. They would fail. Failure would propagate like a zipper opening. The tail would separate, but the rivets held. Every single one. Dawson's work was perfect. Barrett leveled at 8,000 feet. He did a barrel roll, an Immelman turn, a split S. He threw the aircraft through every maneuver in the tactical handbook, pushing harder than Republic test pilots ever dared. The Frankenstein did not complain. It responded with precision and grace. The mismatched tail, welded in a freezing hangar by a mechanic with hacksaw and plumb bob, held firm against the finest engineering principles. At 10:48 hours, Barrett landed. He taxied to hardstand and shut down. Sudden silence after sustained roar was almost painful. He sat a moment, hands trembling from adrenaline, before sliding the canopy back. Dawson was waiting, arms crossed, face neutral, but something in his eyes, pride maybe, relief, or quiet satisfaction of a craftsman who had done impossible work perfectly. Barrett climbed out, jumped to concrete, pulled off helmet and oxygen mask. His face was marked with rubber seal imprints, red lines across cheeks and forehead. He walked to Dawson, did not salute, extended his hand. "You were right, Sergeant. She's tougher than ever, better than factory new. You fixed something Republic got wrong. She flies straighter than she ever did." Dawson shook his hand. Firm grip, rough, calloused palm. "Just good American iron, Lieutenant. Just tightened bolts." It was a lie. What Dawson had done was not simple maintenance. It was a miracle of improvisation and skill. But he would never claim credit. That was not who he was. The real test came 4 days later. On July 10, 1943, mission orders came down. Target, Bremen, Germany. The A.G. Weser submarine yards and Focke-Wulf aircraft factory. Deep penetration. The bomber stream would stretch 20 miles, 96 B-17s, 64 P-47 escorts from the 56th. The Luftwaffe would be up in force. Intelligence estimated 60-plus fighters. JG-1 and JG-11 equipped with latest Focke-Wulf 190A5 models. Barrett walked to his aircraft in pre-dawn darkness. Morning fog was thick. Half-Pint sat on hardstand like a bruised prizefighter. The mismatched aluminum gleamed dully in weak light. An ugly machine. It lacked sleek uniformity of factory-fresh fighters. But it was his machine. And it was ready. Dawson was there, as always. He helped Barrett strap in, adjusted harness, wiped condensation from windscreen, checked oxygen connections and radio leads. Did not speak. Nothing left to say. Barrett closed canopy, went through startup. The Pratt & Whitney caught first attempt, settling into familiar syncopated thunder. He taxied out with the squadron, 64 Thunderbolts forming in darkness, exhausts glowing blue in fog. They took off in flights of 4. Runway lights streaked past, wheels lifted. England's coast disappeared as they climbed through overcast. At 20,000 feet, they broke into brilliant sunlight. The bomber formation was ahead, a massive convoy stretching across sky. At 0847 hours, they crossed the Dutch coast at 27,500 feet. Outside temperature -38 Fahrenheit. Barrett's fuel gauges read 288 gallons. 137 minutes flying time. The radio crackled. "Bandits, 12 o'clock high, 40 plus, diving." Barrett looked up. Against the sun's glare, he saw them. Black dots. Dozens. Focke-Wulf 190A5. S from JG-1, diving in classic ambush. He hit the release for belly drop tank. It fell away, tumbling toward Earth 5 miles below. He switched to internal fuel and turned on gunsight. The illuminated reticle appeared on windscreen. The Focke-Wulfs came fast. Barrett spotted one diving on a B-17 that had dropped behind formation. The bomber's No. 2 engine trailed white smoke. Coolant leak. The crew was in trouble. Barrett rolled inverted and pushed nose down. Half-pint accelerated like a falling anvil. Altimeter unwound. 27,000, 25, 23. Airspeed built rapidly. 350, 380, 400, 435. He was closing on the Focke-Wulf at combined speed over 200 miles per hour. The German was fixated on the bomber, had not seen Barrett. 800 yards, 600, 400, 200. Barrett put the illuminated dot on enemy tail and squeezed trigger. 850 caliber machine guns opened fire simultaneously. 65 rounds per second, 400 rounds in a 2.3-second burst. The recoil slowed Half-Pint in mid-air. The armor-piercing incendiary stream bridged the gap in less than a second. They stitched across the Focke-Wulf's right wing route. The wing structure failed catastrophically. The entire right wing separated, cartwheeling away. The Focke-Wulf flipped inverted and began spinning. The pilot did not bail out. Centrifugal force was too great. He rode the wreckage down. Barrett pulled up hard, trading excess speed for altitude. The zoom climb was the P-47's signature move. Dive fast, shoot, climb away before enemy could react. He climbed back to 26,000 and checked instruments. Fuel, 241 gallons, 115 minutes. Ammunition, 2,880 rounds remaining, 85%. The bomber formation was 260 miles from home. At current speed, 65 minutes to English coast. That left 50 minutes fuel margin, enough to stay and fight. For the next 17 minutes, Barrett fought for his life. He twisted and turned and climbed and dove. The sky was full of aircraft, friend and enemy, tangling in three-dimensional ballet of violence. Tracer rounds arced across blue. Aircraft fell, trailing smoke and flame. Parachutes blossomed like white flowers. A Focke-Wulf got on Barrett's tail. The German was good. He stayed through a hard right turn, matching degree for degree. Barrett could see muzzle flashes. Cannon shells streaked past canopy close enough to see. Orange spheres, the size of baseballs, moving 3,000 feet per second. Barrett reversed hard left. The P-47's roll rate was 110 degrees per second, faster than the Focke-Wulf's 90. He snapped stick to left stop. The aircraft rolled. The German could not follow. He overshot, flashing past Barrett's nose. Barrett pulled trigger. 1.1 seconds. 250 rounds. The Focke-Wulf's engine cowling erupted in flame. Black smoke poured from cylinders. The enemy fighter nosed down, streaming fire, and disappeared into clouds. Barrett checked fuel. 167 gallons. 80 minutes. Position: west of Bremen, heading coast. Distance home: 285 miles. At 240 miles per hour, that was 71 minutes. Fuel margin: 9 minutes. Tight, but manageable. The bomber formation was intact. Damaged, but intact. The fighter escort had done its job. The Luftwaffe was breaking off, low on fuel and ammunition. Barrett landed at Halesworth at 12:47 hours. He taxied to hardstand and shut down. The Pratt & Whitney coughed twice and fell silent. He sat in cockpit, breathing hard, flight suit soaked with sweat despite cold. Ground crews swarmed over the aircraft. 3 small holes in left wing from machine gun fire. A small dent in cowling where shrapnel had struck. Nothing serious. Nothing requiring more than a few hours' work. Dawson walked up as Barrett climbed out. The sergeant looked at the aircraft, at scorched gun ports, at oil streaks on cowling. "How'd she do, Lieutenant?" Barrett pulled off gloves. His hands still shook slightly. "Perfect, Frank. Absolutely perfect. Pulled 7 Gs in a hard break, dove to 450. She never hesitated. Your rigging is flawless." Dawson nodded slowly. He walked around the aircraft, running hand over splice line, checking for any sign of failure. There was none. Not a single rivet had moved. Not a single weld had cracked. He glanced back at the fuselage through the mirror. He could see the splice line. No smoke, no vibration. The aircraft that had been declared scrap metal 2 weeks ago was now outfighting Germany's finest. The impossible had become unstoppable. 2 days later, Colonel Hubert Zemke, commanding officer of the 56th Fighter Group, called Dawson into his office. Zemke was a legendary fighter pilot, hard and efficient, a man who did not waste words. "Sergeant Dawson, I'm promoting you to technical sergeant, and I'm recommending you for the Bronze Star for meritorious service." Dawson stood at attention. "Sir, I appreciate the promotion, but I must respectfully decline the medal." Zemke frowned. "Decline? Sergeant, you rebuilt a Category E write-off into a combat-ready fighter in 8 days. That's extraordinary work." "Sir, I was just doing my job, keeping my pilot alive. That's what crew chiefs do. I don't need a medal for that." Zemke studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded. "All right, Sergeant. Dismissed." Dawson saluted and left. He walked back to the maintenance hangar where Half-Pint sat, being refueled and rearmed for the next mission. He climbed on the wing and looked at the splice line. 1,847 rivets, each driven by hand, each holding against the violence of combat. He thought about his son David, 19 years old, dead at Pearl Harbor. He thought about Jim Barrett, 23 years old, alive because of aluminum and rivets and stubborn refusal to accept defeat. The Frankenstein flew again the next day, and the day after that. Half-Pint became a legend in the 56th Fighter Group. Proof that the P-47 could survive anything. Proof that American ground crews could resurrect the dead. Between July 10, 1943 and April 16, 1945, Half-Pint flew 87 combat missions. The mismatched fighter with the olive-drab nose and silver tail became one of the most recognizable aircraft in the 8th Air Force. Jim Barrett flew her for 43 of those missions. He scored 28 aerial victories, making him the third highest ace in the 56th Fighter Group. He shot down Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s over France, Belgium, Holland, and Germany. He escorted bombers to Berlin. He strafed trains and airfields. He fought through flak that turned the sky black. On every mission, he thought about the 1,847 rivets holding the tail section to the fuselage. He thought about Frank Dawson's hands, scarred and oil-stained, driving each one home with precision and care. The aircraft took battle damage 14 times, flak holes, bullet strikes, cannon shell impacts. Each time, Dawson and his team repaired her. They patched aluminum skin. They replaced hydraulic lines. They rewired systems. They kept her flying. In November 1943, they installed a new paddle blade propeller that increased top speed by 15 miles per hour. In February 1944, they retrofitted a K-14 computing gun sight. In August 1944, they added underwing racks for 8 5-inch HVAR rockets. But they never touched the splice. The 1,847 rivets that Dawson had driven in that freezing hangar in July of 1943 remained untouched. Perfect. Holding. After Barrett completed his combat tour in March 1944, other pilots flew Half-Pint. Lieutenant Thomas Bradford, Captain William Morrison, Lieutenant Robert Sheffield. Each one trusted their life to Dawson's work. Each one came home. The final mission was April 16, 1945. Lieutenant Gordon Sheffield was at the controls, strafing the München rail yard as the Third Reich collapsed around them. A 37mm flak shell punched through the left wing. Non-critical damage. Sheffield brought Half-Pint home one last time. 3 weeks later, on May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Half-Pint sat on the hardstand at Halesworth with the rest of the 56th Fighter Group, her guns finally silent. The olive-drab paint was faded and oil-stained. The silver tail was pockmarked with shrapnel scars. But the splice line was still perfect, still holding. In August 1945, Half-Pint was declared surplus. In October, she was flown to a depot in southern England and parked in a field with hundreds of other fighters. Thunderbolts and Mustangs and Lightnings, aircraft that had won the war, aircraft that were no longer needed. The decision was made to scrap her. The aluminium was valuable, it could be recycled. turned into housing materials for the post-war building boom, turned into automobiles, turned into anything except what she was. No one thought to preserve her. No one thought about museums. She was just another war-weary fighter, one among thousands. In late October, Half-Pint was cut apart with torches. The wings were removed. The tail section separated one final time. The fuselage was sectioned. The metal was loaded onto trucks and hauled away to be melted down. The 1,847 rivets that Frank Dawson had driven by hand, that had held through 87 combat missions, through flak and fighters and 7G turns, were melted into slag and poured into molds. Some of that aluminum became siding on houses in Birmingham. Some became body panels on Ford automobiles. Some became soda cans. The aircraft that should not have flown disappeared, transformed from a legend into the mundane materials of peace. Jim Barrett returned to Tulsa in June 1945. He was 25 years old. He had 28 victories, the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Silver Stars, the respect of every man who had flown with him. He married Sarah, his 4'11", 98-pound Half-Pint. They had 3 children. He flew for Trans World Airlines for 22 years, piloting Constellations and 707s across the Atlantic. When he retired from TWA, he became a flight instructor. He never talked about the war unless someone asked. When they did, he talked about the aircraft, about the P-47, about how it had brought him home when it should have killed him. And he talked about Frank Dawson. In 1987, at a reunion of the 56th Fighter Group, a young historian interviewed Barrett. She asked him about his victories, about his tactics, about the famous missions. Barrett waved it all away. "You want to know the real story?" he said. "The real story is a 38-year-old sergeant from Illinois who rebuilt my aircraft with hand tools in a freezing hangar. Every time I flew Half-Pint after that day, I felt Frank in the cockpit with me. That plane had a soul. Frank put it there." The historian asked if Dawson had received recognition. "They tried to give him the Bronze Star," Barrett said. "He refused it, said he was just doing his job. That was Frank. Didn't want credit, just wanted his pilots to come home." Barrett paused, looked out the window at the modern airport beyond, jets taking off into a peaceful sky. "You know what I think about sometimes?" he said quietly. "Half-Pint is gone, melted down, turned into car parts and house siding. But somewhere out there, there's a piece of aluminium that used to be part of that splice, part of those 1,847 rivets, and that piece of metal survived the impossible. It held when it shouldn't have, because a mechanic in a muddy field decided that impossible just meant nobody had done it yet." Jim Barrett died in 2004 at the age of 84 in Tulsa, Oklahoma. He was buried with military honors. His obituary mentioned his 28 victories. It mentioned his decorations. It mentioned his career with TWA. It did not mention the 1,847 rivets, or the freezing hangar, or the impossible splice that held through 87 missions. Frank Dawson returned to Springfield, Illinois in August 1945. He was 40 years old. He had a promotion to technical sergeant. He had refused a Bronze Star. He had kept more pilots alive than he could count. He went back to work as an auto mechanic. He fixed Chevrolets and Fords and Dodges for people who had no idea what he had done during the war. He married a woman named Margaret who worked at the telephone company. They had no children. In 1952, he became a shop teacher at Springfield High School. He taught teenagers how to weld, how to work a lathe, how to read blueprints, how to solve problems with hand tools and determination. He never talked about the war. The other teachers knew he had served. They saw the Army Air Force discharge papers framed on his office wall. But he deflected questions. In 1978, a student doing a history project asked him about his service. Dawson was 63 years old. He looked at the kid for a long moment. Then he told the story. The whole story. The wreck in the boneyard, the decision to rebuild, the splice, the rivets, the test flight, the 87 missions. The student asked why he had never told anyone. "I fixed planes," Dawson said. "The pilots did the heroic part. I just tightened bolts. There's no story in that." "But you saved Lieutenant Barrett's life," the student said. "You saved all those pilots' lives." Dawson shook his head. "I gave them a machine that worked. They were the ones who flew it into combat. They were the ones who faced death every day. I was safe on the ground. There's a difference." The student wrote his paper. It won an award at the state history fair. The local newspaper ran a story. "Local teacher was war hero." Dawson hated the headline. He was not a hero, he said. He was a mechanic. Frank Dawson died in 1993 at the age of 88. He was buried in Oak Ridge Cemetery in Springfield next to his wife Margaret. A simple headstone, his name, his dates. Staff Sergeant, United States Army Air Force. It did not mention Half Pint, or Jim Barrett, or the 1,847 rivets. But in 1995, Springfield High School renamed its shop class building. They called it Dawson Hall. Inside, on the wall, they hung a plaque. It read, "Dedicated to Frank Dawson, who taught us that impossible just means nobody has done it yet." The bigger picture was this. Between 1942 and 1945, the 8th Air Force lost 4,145 aircraft in combat. But they salvage repaired an estimated 2,800 aircraft. Every repaired plane was a weapon immediately available to commanders. Every repaired plane flew an average of 40 more missions. Every repaired plane protected an average of 80 bomber crewmen. Frank Dawson was one of thousands of mechanics who performed this work. Nameless, unrecognized, essential. The Germans could not match this. Their supply lines were crumbling, their factories were being bombed. When a German plane was damaged, it often stayed damaged. They lacked spare parts. They lacked fuel. Eventually, they lacked the skilled mechanics to keep them flying. The American philosophy was different. Aircraft were designed to be modular, field repairable. But design meant nothing without the hands to do the work. In a post-war interview conducted in 1974, Werner Hoffmann, the German ace who had shot down Jim Barrett on June 26, 1943, was asked about the Allied victory. Hoffmann was 59 years old. He had survived the war with 87 confirmed victories. He had spent 2 years in Soviet captivity. He had returned to Germany and become a commercial airline pilot. "We had better pilots early in the war," Hoffmann said. "Better training, more experience. But the Americans had better logistics, always. They repaired aircraft we would have scrapped. They kept constant pressure. That is what won the war. Not tactics, not courage, logistics." The interviewer asked about specific encounters he remembered. Hoffmann thought for a moment. "June 1943, over Abbeville. I shot down a Thunderbolt. 21 cannon hits, 200 machine gun hits. The pilot should have died. The aircraft should have crashed. Instead, it flew back to England. I saw it myself. I could not believe it. I saluted the pilot because what else could I do? That aircraft should not have flown, but it did. That was American engineering, American stubbornness." The interviewer asked if he ever learned what happened to that aircraft. "No," Hoffmann said. "I assume it was scrapped. Too much damage. But I have thought about it over the years. That pilot, that aircraft. I put everything I had into destroying it, and it survived. There is a lesson in that. I am not sure what the lesson is, but there is one." The P-47 Thunderbolt holds a unique record. Throughout the entire war, across hundreds of thousands of sorties, with thousands of aircraft involved, the P-47 had a loss rate of less than 0.7% per sortie. It was the safest fighter of the war for a pilot to fly. Pilots joked about it. If you wanted to impress a girl, you flew a P-51 Mustang. Sleek, fast, glamorous. If you wanted to survive the war and marry her, you flew a P-47. Tough, reliable, ugly but effective. The final truth is this. History remembers aces. Museums display their aircraft, textbooks teach their tactics, documentaries film their dogfights. But victory was not built in the sky, it was built on the ground, in freezing hangars at 3 in the morning, by men with grease under their fingernails and wrenches in their pockets, men who worked 20-hour shifts, who slept on cots next to aircraft, who refused to accept that something was broken beyond repair. Men like Frank Dawson. There are no statues of Frank Dawson. There are no congressional medals. His name appears in no history books. But in Springfield, Illinois, there is a high school shop class where students learn to weld and work metal and solve problems. And on the wall of that shop class, there is a plaque. And on that plaque, there are words that Frank Dawson would have dismissed as nonsense, but that are nevertheless true. Impossible just means nobody has done it yet. On June 26, 1943, Half Pint was a Category E total loss, scrap metal, beyond salvage. On July 6, 1943, she was a combat-ready fighter. On April 16, 1945, she was still flying, still fighting, still held together by 1,847 rivets driven by hand in a freezing hangar by a mechanic who refused to quit. That is not engineering. That is not luck. That is American stubbornness given form. You can break an American machine, you cannot break an American mechanic. If this story has moved you, honor Frank Dawson's memory by remembering that every victory has invisible hands behind it. Share this with family who understand what duty truly means. Remember the mechanics. Remember the ground crews. Remember the men who never sought glory, but who built the foundation of victory with their hands. And remember this: when someone tells you something is impossible, they are only telling you that nobody has done it yet, until someone does.